Welcome everybody. Today I'm going to show you a blitz game I played against a 1650 player. There's some instructive things in it, and it's a fun game, and it's a Sicilian defence. My opponent opened e4 and I replied c5. For those of you who don't know openings, c5 is the Sicilian defence. My opponent just played knight f3 and then I played d6. My opponent now played d4. Now the d4 characterises the mainline variation of the Sicilian defence. So this is the main line, and now in the mainline Sicilian, black always replies c takes d4. It's possible you could play queen a5, but for argument's sake, and c takes d4 always takes place. White then has a choice, can play queen takes d4, but for the moment and for this purposes, white recaptures knight d4, and this is officially the main line of the Sicilian defence. So it's a sophisticated opening, but also an aggressive one. And here black plays a6. a6 is what's known as the Sicilian Najdorf variation, and it was named after the Argentinian grandmaster Miguel Najdorf. Now white here plays bishop e3. He has choices, bishop e2, other move. I replied e5. It's an aggressive move. I'm kicking the knight away from d4. Again, black has alternatives. You could play knight g4 is one. So of course I played the move e5 and the knight retreats to b3. I then played bishop e7, which you can see, and white plays queen d2, which is quite an attacking formation. I then played queen c7 and white castles long. Play knight bd7. Now we reach here a critical position. White plays f3, and this is a really attacking line. He's threatening pawn on g2 to g4, and he's also threatening pawn on h2 to h4, basically to kick my knight on f6 away and to storm his pawns down the board. Anyhow, I played, as you will see, at h5, and this basically is to prevent white playing g2 to g4. The downside of this for black is that black's king probably going to remain in the center. So it's a double-edged sword. The position is sharp. So white calmly replies king b1, and I then moved b5. Standard move in the Sicilian Najdorf. White played bishop e2, trying to support g4 at some stage. I then played e7, holding e4 square. Now here white has played his pawn to f3 and should be preparing g4. Instead he plays possibly his first mistake of the game. He plays f4. Now this leaves the pawn on e4 vulnerable to the attack. Black knight on f6 and the bishop on b7. So I'm about to win a pawn, and why not? I take the pawn. For this threatens the queen, white queen, and so white recaptures on e4 with his knight, and I then recapture on e4 with my bishop. Well, having played f4, white is obliged now to take on e5, which is what he does. Now I have a choice here. I can take pawn on d6, taking the pawn on e5. But I prefer to play knight takes e5. This has the advantage of possibly the knight jumping in to c4, threatening the queen and the black squared bishop. So that is what I did. White then plays his knight from b3 to d4, trying to centralise it and at the same time possibly hit b5. I then played the rook from a8 to c8. This is basically to attack the weak spot of the pawn on c2. White then responded with rook c1. An interesting feature of this game is that if you notice, white's pawn on g2 can be taken by my bishop on e4. But I didn't take the pawn. The simple reason that white can play on h1 to g1, attacking the bishop on g2, and then the bishop would have to withdraw, and then white would be able to take the pawn on g7. Oh, bearing in mind the tactics of the g2 and g7 pawns, I then played g6 to prevent to actually make bishop takes g2 a threat. So my opponent plays rook g1, preventing that. And then I played knight c4. And the knight c4 threatens the queen and black squared bishops. So white takes on c4, takes my knight on c4. Now here I have a choice. Do I take with queen or do I take with the pawn? It's a difficult choice. I decided to take with the pawn on b5, taking bishop on c4, opening up the b file, as one can see here, and possibly threatening c3, which would have then hit the queen on d2 and the pawn on b2. Now, in this position, the pawn on c4 moving to c3 is a threat. It threatens the queen on d2, and I would then probably pawn up, try and swap off queens. So my opponent plays the original move, queen c3. So this potentially threatens on the long diagonal from c3 to h8. It threatens my rook. So I then play bishop f6, pinning the knight on d4, and long term attacking the queen on c3. My opponent then calmly plays his pawn from h2 to h3. I retreat my bishop back to g7, preparing short-term castling. The white then plays g4. Now, this is threatening to take on h5 and open up the position. So I play the pawn on h5. White then plays his rook on c1 to e1, trying to provide a discovered attack on my bishop on e4. So I then castle kingside, give my king safe. Now here my opponent then reveals a bishop moving from e3 to g5, attacking my pawn on h4 and attacking my bishop on e4. So in this position, I'm quite happy to sacrifice the pawn on h4, but I need to protect my bishop. So I play queen c7 to queen to b7. White then plays queen e3, attacking my bishop. So the bishop on e4 is now vulnerable. So I play rook f e8, protecting bishop. So there are now two pieces, my rook and queen, protecting the bishop on e4, which is still centralized. So in this position then, now after rook, I played rook f e8. White plays king c1, which is probably not the strongest move in the position. It avoids, however, bishop takes c2, which would have revealed a check. I can actually still play this. I can actually go bishop on e4, takes the pawn on c2. So the rook is revealed onto the queen. But white would simply take the rook with check. I'd recapture with the rook on c8, on e8. And then his rook would come down and check on e8, and my king would have to go to h7. That basically would mean that I'd lost 2 pawns, 2 rooks to a queen, and he could then recapture the bishop on c2 with his knight. Although even that's tactical, because I'd have played d5, pawn from d6 to d5, holding on to the bishop on e4. At this point, my opponent had something like a 45-second advantage over me. And he took the pawn on h4, bishop takes h4. I then played queen b6, trying to generate some attack on some pressure on the b file. My opponent played c3, protecting the knight, as my bishop and queen were attacking. And then I played rook b8. This increases the pressure along the b file. And my opponent then played queen d2, avoiding any pins between my queen and his queen. As you can see, I then played rook from e8 to c8, trying to protect the pawn on c4, but also avoiding any pins on the e file. My opponent then played the strange bishop to f2, and I responded with queen to a5, and attacking his pawn on a2. He quite logically responds with a3, and so we've reached a position where I'm a pawn up and with pressure along the b file. Now after a3, I had exactly 40 seconds left to complete the game. So I then played rook b7, intending to double rooks, and my opponent played h4. He's threatening belatedly to have a pawn storm along the h file. I then played rook c to b8, threatening to take on b2. Now my opponent courageously plays h5, attacking the pawn on g6 or threatening to go h6. I then take rook takes b2 and my opponent takes the rook with his queen. I then take his queen, rook takes b2, and then white plays king b2, as you can see. And we've reached a position where I've got a queen for 2 rooks and a pawn. Down to 32 seconds, I then played queen a5 to a4. This threatens the sequence bishop takes d4, bishop takes d4, queen b3 check. And so my opponent then thought for some time and played the courageous h6. This then produces the following sequence. I then took bishop on g7, taking the knight on d4, and then he recaptured bishop on e3, taking my bishop on d4. We've now reached a position where I then came for the following sequence: queen to b3 check, which the chess.com computer gives as an exclamation mark, please note. This now threatens, if the king goes back to c1, it's checkmate on c2. If the king moves to a1, it's queen on b3 takes on a3, checkmate. Well, the fascinating thing about this position is that if I did not have queen takes queen to b3 check, white has the following amazing sequence: pawn on h6 to h7 check, king takes h7, rook to h1 check, bishop takes h1, rook to 8 takes h1 check, king g8, and then rook to h1 to h8 will be checkmate. Fortunately for me, not his white's move, it's black's. I played queen b3, as I said, and then my opponent resigned. An interesting game, but instructive, that even when you're losing and a pawn down, an amazing sequence like h6 to h7 can produce checkmates with the loss of material. Anyway, hopefully you'll find this game instructive and entertaining, and there will be more to come. As you've probably gathered, we're a new channel, so to help us out, please subscribe and press the notification bell. And please note, your comments are always welcome. Bye for now.